Welcome to the 15-Minute Patriot podcast. I'm Ross, the dude Maher from Rhode Island, and I am joined by my colleague, Dave, the wild man, Wilder from Southeastern Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Now, normally we have our friend David Side from the free state of Florida, but not today. We want to know, or rather, I should say, we do know that there are many outlets and many sites, many ways for you to collect your news. But here at 15-Minute Patriot, we focus on what the news should prompt you to do. We focus on action steps. Knowledge is important, but citizenship requires action. So, even if you'll take just 15 minutes a month, you will be pleasantly surprised to see what you can accomplish. We, the people, are at the top of our government, and it's time to get involved. Lastly, we want to hear from you and about the things that you have done. So you can email us at 15minutepatriot@gmail.com. That's 15minutepatriot spelled out, 15minutepatriot at gmail.com, or on Facebook at 15-Minute Patriot. And with that, leading us off is my man, Dave, the wild man Wilder.
Well, we're going to get into some details here. And I thought, a story came to mind that's been a life lesson for me. When I was working in healthcare, we had a consultant come out and was encouraging us to, how do you solve problems in a very complicated environment? And they brought up a true story, I've been told, and they went at it like this. So Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., the Lincoln Memorial, they had a pigeon problem, and pigeons were messing up all the places around Lincoln Memorial. Not very conducive to the tourists that were coming by. Not a great way to present the United States to all the foreigners that were there. So every day, people would come by with Clorox to clean up all of the pigeon mess. All right. So, somebody came by and says, "Well, why are you doing that?" And they were saying, well, the pigeons are making this mess. We've got to clean it. But unfortunately, it's ruining the marble and stuff around the memorial. They says, well, why are the pigeons here? Well, the pigeons were there because they were eating a lot of spiders. There were a lot of spiders that would come out, and the birds would be eating the spiders. Okay. So the next question is, why are the spiders there? So the spiders are there because they were eating. Again, Lincoln Memorial is right on the Potomac in the evening or at dusk. A lot of these little bugs, midges and stuff come out, and the spiders would eat the midges. And with all the lights glaring at the Lincoln Memorial, the midges would come out of the waterway. The spiders would go after him. The pigeons would come by and make a mess. So the solution to the problem of cleaning the Lincoln Memorial was to turn the lights off an hour earlier. So, it was a real lesson to me about critical thinking. You have a problem and there's a quick answer, but it might not be the right answer. So when we're looking into things going with governance and what's happening in Washington, all we get really is a 10-second sound bites, but we really have to go a little bit deeper. So I'm kind of looking forward to this conversation. Ross, you've brought up a number of times when you were working in the military, you're kind of in the trenches in the government structure that I never had an experience with. And you've brought up some topics about that. So, we've heard about the millions of dead people that are still alive in the Social Security database. We've heard about the zombie agencies that haven't been authorized and shouldn't have been authorized for 40 years. And we've been educated by Representative Hageman on how the NGOs are basically used to steal money from the taxpayers to, fund pet projects or their own personal savings accounts without any kind of oversight. So how should things work? Do you see this kind of stuff when you were in the trenches, if you will? So I'm kind of curious as to what your thoughts are from your perspective, kind of as an insider.
So my initial thought is that in the interest of full disclosure and for our listening audience, I joined the Rhode Island National Guard in 1996. and I retired from the Rhode Island National Guard in 2022. So give or take 25 years. 23 and a half of those years, I worked for them full time. And in that time frame, I also had two deployments. And I used to crack a joke, and I kind of meant it somewhat seriously, but it was somewhat of a joke. Um, my first deployment was before deployments were the cool thing to do, because we would have people signing up for deployment after deployment after deployment, especially after 9/11, which obviously is a very
Okay.
serious event,
Yep. 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 I can
and
see that.
also our war efforts. Sorry, I just dropped my pen. Our war efforts in both Afghanistan as well as Iraq, regardless of what the listening audience thinks of the merits of those wars. That's kind of a sidebar issue. But my first deployment was in 2000, and I went to Hungary, predominantly in Hungary, but we operated in Croatia as well as Bosnia, and it was part of a peacekeeping mission. And it was an overall NATO mission, but President Bill Clinton helped to negotiate peace of ethnic cleansing that was going on in deep in Eastern Europe. And Kosovo actually kicked up somewhat after that point. And there was a point in time where both of those operations, for lack of a better term, were going simultaneously. So my first deployment, I remember where I was exactly. I
Hmm.
was in the dining facility when we heard about the USS Cole getting
Hmm.
bombed,
Hmm.
and that was kind of like the somewhat of a starting point, if you will, of that Islamic retaliation against the West. So it wasn't just there. I would the way that I would describe it is that we had two embassies in East Africa that were attacked first. Then it was the Cole, and then ultimately it was 9/11, and that was kind of
Hmm.
the pinnacle, if you will, before we finally did something. So it kind of helps to put things a little bit into context. At the same time, yeah, I definitely experienced um, points in time. We talk a lot about fraud, waste, abuse. That comes up a lot. And so, yeah, I would argue I was on the inside, in that I worked for the government in a sense through the DoD. And I really saw this mostly when I was deployed. I would say the biggest example of it, my second deployment, was to Guantanamo Bay, which is now this
Hmm.
big infamous place. The funny thing is, I always talk with my every holiday. I always talk with one of my wife's uncles who was in the Navy, and his ship was stationed at Guantanamo Bay, and it was no big deal. Guantanamo didn't become a big deal until after 9/11.
Hmm.
And so it's kind of funny. He and I reminisce about being there, and he tells jokes about how, you know, he'd be at the enlisted club and he'd get on what we would call a cattle car, which was kind of like this trailer like device attached to a truck. And you just kind of get on the back of it. And he said, you start looking around. Of course, all the sailors, they have whatever ship they're assigned to is sewn onto their uniform. And he would be like, you start looking around, and it's like, yeah, there's no guys from my boat on this thing. And he's like, sure enough, within a few minutes, they literally would throw them off. He's like, I can't tell you how many times I woke up in the shrubs because I get on a cattle car trying to go back to my ship. And yeah, there's nobody on my boat on this thing. So, they get thrown off. Um, and so even at Guantanamo Bay, I saw examples of certainly wasteful spending, maybe not necessarily fraudulent, but definitely wasteful and occasionally abusive. And that was, after so many years, I spent nearly 8 years, almost 9 years enlisted, and then I became an officer. I went to Officer Kennedy School, and so here I am as a relatively junior officer. Um, and I'm responsible for a lot of federal dollars to support that mission because on that deployment I was working in logistics, and one of my primary responsibilities actually was the acquisition of product. you know our service members needed supplies. The detainees needed supplies, everything, consumables of a lot of different kinds. And it was there were times, we had a phrase that we used, and it wasn't the kindest phrase, I will admit. But a lot of it had to do with, are you kidding me? We're gonna buy, I can't believe we're buying this. We're gonna do this.
So I
And
guess that's one of my questions, Ross. I mean,
sure.
I've been in management in the corporate world, and there's policies and procedures, and you got to follow the policy. And if you don't follow the policy and procedure, somebody's going to slap your hand at best. So in the hierarchy of management, where where do you think things are more likely to go astray? I mean, if you're told to buy something that you don't think should be bought, did you really have any kind of leeway to question it?
You really don't. I would say, in military terms, those decisions are really happening certainly at the general officer level, or to kind of make it more transparent across services, the flag officer, right? So you're talking generals of the Army, Air Force, Marines, flag officer, and admirals of the Navy. So guys and gals who wear stars, right? They're really the true decision makers. People who are at the '06 pay grade, which would be colonels and captains in the Navy, colonels everywhere else, they really do also wield quite a bit of power in terms of how government resources are spent. And as an
So would
example,
would
good.
that level be the level in which something could be halted if there was some fraud or abuse? Would they have the leeway to say something? Or there's
Absolutely. I mean, they're not the ones who are making like the actual action of the purchase of said product, but they would absolutely weigh in and say, "You're not buying that. Like, don't even think about it." But at the same time, depending on the circumstances, they're the person who is saying, "Absolutely, you're going to buy that, and you're not going to question why we're buying that." I'll give you an example, and I don't think I'm violating any type of thing that I've signed, because I'm not. So I had to buy a traction table
okay.
because we had a detainee who apparently had some type of, and I don't know what detainee, who apparently had some type of a back injury of some kind, some
Mhm.
type of nerve damage or whatever the heck, a traction table is actually used for. Um, and I remember talking with someone who I think was actually a doctor of some kind, and he basically said to me, "It's cheaper to buy the table and have it shipped down here and try this than it is to risk or bringing in orthopedic surgeons to try to fix this dude." And this would make most Americans blood boil. So think about this for a second.
So it was an
Here you
ROI
have it.
decision?
What do you mean by our return on investment?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It
Um,
was the cheapest option.
Kind of, but then you say to yourself, and this was always one of the struggles that we had is, well, why is this our responsibility in the first place?
Huh. Okay. Yeah, yeah.
Right? Like, we didn't beat this guy up and mess up his spine, or otherwise cause him nerve damage. Like, we didn't do that. He showed up and he's had problems. It's kind of like you hear these
So
stories about how Osama bin Laden was a diabetic, right? We didn't give the guy diabetes, but he had this issue. And this is something that is somewhat a phenomenon within the military. Like, if when you join the military, if you don't have an issue, I'll give you a perfect example. When I joined the military, I didn't have sleep apnea, right?
yeah.
Obstructive sleep apnea. When I left the military, I did. And in my last couple of years, I did as well. And so my point is that as you develop medical conditions, the military just owns it. And
If you're
so
in the
now,
military, yes. Mhm.
if you're in the military,
Yeah, yeah.
so
But it's not job related.
but it's not necessarily job related. It's not like I
Yeah,
broke my ankle while I was on duty,
yeah.
and now I have ankle problems the rest of my life. So here we are in a position where we're purchasing basically a traction table because that is the cheapest option here in all of this. Now, oddly enough, and I remember this very distinctly, I I wasn't even slated to go to Guantanamo Bay yet, And I remember a guy who was my boss, a colonel here in Rhode Island, who needed an orthopedic surgery. He was getting something done on his knee,
Yeah.
and his surgery got delayed because the surgeon had to go TDY. TDY stands for temporary duty yonder. Nice southern term, right? Yonder. Um, so I surmised, I'm like, wait a minute. Um, without, kind of giving up, other, I don't know, sensitive stuff, I guess. But I surmised, I'm like, this orthopedic surgeon, who is one of the best orthopedic surgeons in the Navy, who happens to be stationed at Newport, Rhode Island, where all the Rhode Island National Guard full timers go to for all their medical care, is getting sent TDY on a mission that he can't talk about. And it occurred to me, he probably went to Guantanamo Bay to do some orthopedic surgeries on the
On this
detainees
guy.
who were
Yeah.
having some issues. And it was just like one of those where, and then of course, within 10 months, where am I going to
Yeah.
Guantanamo Bay and I'm running into these same situations?
I
Um,
guess what I think, what came out with Doge with US aid and all that stuff,
mm,
$50 million for condoms for Gaza.
it's
So
crazy.
I'm thinking, what is the decision, sequence that someone at the top says, yeah, we're going to do this, and everybody just passes that along, even though it's outside scope of work and all that stuff. It just boggles the mind.
It really does. And you start getting into, and I was, prepping for a briefing I was supposed to do to a state level senator today that didn't happen. And one of the things that came up as I was kind of reading along and doing my prep is how many people, whether you're at the federal, state, county, or municipal level, all military, actually all military personnel, we swear allegiance to the Constitution. And so it kind of got me thinking, and you were just kind of saying it as well. It's like the at the same time in that oath, and this is kind of like that crux that you get to is like, is this order that this officer is giving me, is it constitutional? Is it lawful? Do you? And I do remember having some heated discussions with someone at Guantanamo Bay about the ethics of how we were spending dollars.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and the only reason why I was having that discussion is because my supervisor was on leave. So I was the next ranking person. So I had to have the discussion with them. And at times I felt like I was compelled to do things that I had ethical problems with in terms of expending taxpayer dollars. And I remember coming home after that and, telling different stories and just talking with other military personnel. And they're like, I cannot believe that you spent government resources on X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
I'll give you another one. And again, I don't think it violates the that thing that I signed, the non-disclosure. Um, we had what we called detainee water and non-detainee water. So we had a bottled water contract. So a little bit of history here. The members of the Rhode Island National Guard were some of the first to be at Guantanamo Bay in terms of the detention operation. So a lot of the times when you see people talk about Guantanamo Bay, and it's funny for me and a lot of service members because one of the things you hone in on is what uniform are they wearing. Right away, it kind of
Yeah.
gives you an era of time. And so here we are in 2010, 2015. I've seen stuff as far back recently as 2020. They're still showing footage literally from like 2002. We have like they're showing people who are wearing uniforms we haven't worn in like 15 plus years. So it kind of gives you an age as to what's happening. So initially, as those detention operations were being set up, of course you have to provide people with water. Okay, that's normal. Um, and they had access to what we would call a water buffalo, which was basically a water trailer. It's
Yeah.
it's like a
Yeah.
container
Yeah.
on wheels. It's a tank, a water tank, right? You go up to it, you get your water, and it's no big deal. Well, at some point, somebody had this light bulb idea, and it was probably a detainee because they used to do like uh they would protest so they wouldn't eat, right?
Hmm.
A hunger strike, that was the word that we used to use. They're hunger striking. They're refusing to eat to try to prove a somewhat of a political point, or trying to undermine what was going on there. So um, at some point, they decided that the way to fix this problem was, well, we're going to give them bottled water, because they were saying that we were putting stuff in the water. Okay, fine. We're going to give you bottled water. So now it's a government contract to send bottled water halfway across the Caribbean on a barge in a shipping container, by mind you. And that barge was pulled by a tugboat. It would take 5 days. I'm serious when I'm saying this. Okay. It was a 5 day pull from Fort Lauderdale down to Guantanamo Bay.
Yep.
And it was a 5 day pull all the way back. And the time in between was loading and offloading. And one of the things that was brought in was bottled water for detainees. Then, but wait, it's like a Ginsu knife. But wait, there's more. Okay. If that wasn't good enough, then eventually the detainees started saying the labels are red, white, and blue. And you're
Yeah.
trying to convince us, mentally convince us, suggesting to us that red, white, and blue is good.
Hmm.
So then that is how we ended up with quote unquote detainee water. It was unlabeled. So now the contract then changed. Okay, wait, right? The contract changed. So now the bottles could not have labels on them because the labels were predominantly red, white, and blue.
Yeah, we're getting into some silly stuff here.
So I'm telling you, I offloaded. I spilled a pallet of water right in front of, like I was trying to do my helping out and offloading pallets of water that would come in, and I dumped an entire pallet right there at the opening of our warehouse because I hit the brakes too hard, and the shrink wrap gave way, and these pallets just
Yep.
they just literally blew open. We had bottles of water all over the place,
Yeah.
hundreds of them.
Well, I'm kind of
Um,
curious if anybody listening has stories as well. So you can send them to us at 15minutepatriot@gmail.com, 15minutepatriot@gmail.com. And as an action step, I think it would be fun to contact your representative, your local representative, your state rep, and ask them how much of their time is spent overseeing the monies that were allocated. Does he have any time with the staff? How is the oversight operation happening in his office? I think that would be a good question to ask all of our representatives. But for now, that's all the time we have, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.